Hello, everybody, and welcome to Miss Peggy's Story Time. Tonight we're going to start a new book called The Tanglewoods Secret. Here's the cover of it for you to look at. And you can see that this is about some children, and there's an old man in there, too. So let's talk about them for just a second. Okay, this girl's name is Ruth, right here. And this is her brother, Philip. And this is their friend, Terry, back there. And this is going to be Mr. Tandy. He's a shepherd. And back behind them are the Tanglewoods. So, and it's written by, is the author's name on here? Yes, Patricia St. John. And you may have heard of her. She's quite a well-known writer and was a missionary nurse. She lived in Switzerland. She lived in Morocco. Some of the stories that she wrote were set there, but she grew up in England. She grew up in the part of the country called Herefordshire, and I'm showing you oops, where did my map go? Come on now, come back. Come back, map. I don't know how to get rid of this thing here. Sorry. Anyway, here's a picture of a map. Well, Miss Peggy, never mind. Tomorrow night when we come back, I'll show you I'll do better. Maybe I'll have an actual picture and not just my iPad, which I bumble and stumble around with. Anyway, she lived in Herefordshire, that's over near the Welsh border in England. And her father was a pastor, and she grew up in a very happy home. And many of the stories that she tells are based on her own life. And so this is one of them. This is based on events that happened in her own life. So this chapter 1, begins with a sugar bun for supper. Now, you know, Miss Peggy's got to explain things. We're in England, back like we were when we were doing the Chronicles of Narnia. And supper is one of 4 meals that you generally eat in England. You have breakfast, and then you have dinner at lunchtime at noon, and then you have tea at 4 o'clock or so. And tea is not just a cup of tea; it's a regular sit-down meal sometimes with cooked food, sometimes with just cold sandwiches and a cup of tea, of course, and buns and things like that. And then supper is something that you eat just before you go to bed. It might be a cup of cocoa and some biscuits. And in this story, it's a sugar bun for supper. But supper is just a little snacky meal that you have just before you go to bed. Excuse me. One evening when I was 8 years old, I had been sent to bed without supper, and I was in disgrace. I lay in bed that beautiful evening, listening for the stump of a rather slow boy in football shoes climbing up the stairs to our attic. When Philip, my brother, did come, he came straight to my room. He struggled with a queer-looking bump in his sock, and then out came a squashed sugar bun. There was wool fluff stuck to the sugar, and yes, a woolly smell about it. But Philip was proud of what he had done. It was right under Aunt Margaret's nose that he had slipped it into his sock, and she never noticed. Oh, sure, I ate it. And Philip sat down on my bed to comfort me. I always liked plenty of sympathy in those times. What else did you have for supper? I asked, with my mouth full of bun. Oh, I'm afraid we had sausages, he said apologetically, but they were too squishy to put down my sock. And they weren't very nice. You didn't miss very much. Philip knew I loved sausages. It was very unkind of Aunt Margaret to send me to bed without my supper, I started to say in my most pathetic voice. If Mother were here, she wouldn't be unkind to me like that. No, answered Philip, she wouldn't. But then you see, you really were awfully rude to Aunt Margaret, and you know that you never would have been rude to Mother. How do you know? I said. I might. Oh, no, he assured me, you wouldn't. There wouldn't be anything to be rude about. You're only rude when you're cross, and we were never cross when we were with Mother. She was so happy and starry, and if we were a little bit naughty, you know, in England they use the word naughty a lot, and it means what we would say bad. We use naughty too sometimes, but they use it all the time and hardly ever say bad. As when we're talking about behavior, that is. And if we were a bit naughty, she used to laugh and pick us up in her arms and tell us lovely stories, and we'd forget all about being naughty. I wish you could remember her, Ruth. I opened my mouth to ask more, but Philip suddenly hopped off my bed and dived like a frightened rabbit across the hall. I heard a quick scuffle and then silence. And then the sound of Aunt Margaret's footsteps on the hall steps. She went into Philip's room, and I heard her cross over to him and say, as she tucked him in, "Good night." And then he said, "Good night, Auntie," in rather a breathless voice. And then she came across and stood in the doorway of my room. "Good night, Ruth," she said. If I had answered and said I was sorry, she would have come over and tucked me in too. But I hated saying I was sorry, so I pretended to be asleep, and I gave a very loud snore, which deceived no one, least of all Aunt Margaret. "I'm sorry that you're still in a naughty temper," she remarked coldly, and turned away and went downstairs. "Did she see that you weren't undressed yet?" I whispered across the hall. "No," answered Philip. "I pulled up the bedclothes around my neck. Good night, Ruth." "Good night, Phil," I answered, and turned over toward the window and stared out into the darkness. My mind was full of what Philip had said about Mother. Mother would have come across and kissed me, whether I was sorry or not. And then, of course, I would have been sorry. And we would have looked at the stars together, and she would have told me stories. I fell asleep almost feeling her arms around me, but in my dreams she ran away from me. She and Philip went away together, and when I tried to run after them in my dream, my feet wouldn't move. Philip and I lived with our Aunt Margaret in a beautiful house. It was a white one built on the side of a hill. Oh, the beautiful sunsets we saw behind that hill. There was the garden and the orchard full of wonderful apple trees. We liked our bedrooms because they were at the very top of the house. We left the doors open so that we could talk or shout across the hall. My room and Philip's room each had a window. Sometimes I thought I liked his view best because the view he had was out on the garden and the pine trees on the hill. Mine looked out on the great plain with fields of growing things and cherry trees, which were gorgeous when they were in blossom. Off in the distance was a place I had never visited, and I wondered what it was like over there. Wouldn't you? I wondered sometimes my view showed me the green hills close, and sometimes they seemed misty and far away. And I like to think of those hills as being a fairyland when I would go visiting when I grew up. Philip used to come to my room in the morning, and we would listen to the birds sing or watch the sun come up over my fairy field. We told each other stories about what was going on way out there, about the animals we knew must be living among the trees in the hills. I loved my big brother Philip more than anyone else. He was only a year and a half older than I was, but he was such a sweet, gentle boy, thoughtful, my friend and protector, and a comforter too. We were always together, except when we were in school. Let me tell you how my brother Philip looked. He was sturdy, with a round face that looked calm, and he had nice blue eyes. I was just the opposite. Small, thin, with a sharp chin and dark hair that never stayed where it should. Aunt Margaret loved Philip, and who wouldn't? He was good, and he was obedient. My aunt used to shake her head when she looked at me because she said, "She takes years off my life." You know that was not so good, for it meant that if she only had Philip, she would, and not me, she'd live a lot longer. It is now the time of my story, so that means that we had been with Aunt Margaret for 5 years. We had forgotten what Mother and Father even looked like. I was only 4 years old when Mother and Father sailed far away for the land of India to be missionaries. And I might stop here to say that back in those days, when families did feel the call to be missionaries, moms and dads usually did leave their children behind because the climate in India was very hot and humid. There were malaria mosquitoes everywhere, and often children would get sick and die over there because there weren't many doctors and So parents thought it might be safer and wiser for their children to stay behind. But it was rough on moms and dads, and it was awfully rough on the children, too. Mother was going to come back to us before too long, but then there was a war that stopped her from coming. Do you know, I think I really didn't want her to come back, because Aunt Margaret kept reminding me about how disappointed Mother would be in me. Her letters sounded like she loved me very much, but that's because she didn't know me, I thought. Grown-up visitors always liked Philip, and I knew Mother would too. And Philip would like Mother because he liked everybody. Me, I would much rather have kept my brother Philip all to myself. On that account, I thought of my mother coming back as seldom as I could. Philip talked about Mother because he remembered her, but I didn't. Chapter 2, Holiday Plans. 2 years after the night I told you about in the last chapter, I was now 9.5, and Philip was nearly 11. On the first day of our Easter holidays, or as we would say here, our vacation, Philip came into my room in his pajamas at 6:30 in the morning and curled up at the end of my bed with his notebook and a pencil in hand. And together we leaned our elbows on the windowsill and watched birds and made plans. Bird watching was our great hobby that holiday. We had a notebook in which we recorded each different kind of bird we saw and everything we noticed about it. Its song, its nest, its habits. Philip had made the book himself, and it was beautifully neat and accurate. He did all the writing, and I painted the eggs when we found them, but my drawings weren't particularly good. Philip longed for a camera with which to photograph his nests. If only I could take photographs of them, he would say over and over again. I might be a great naturalist. My book might even be printed. But the cheapest camera in the shop window cost a lot of money, and our money box had about $2.50. That would be in English money, but this author has kindly put it in American money for us to be able to understand. Even though we had been saving for weeks and weeks, we emptied the coins onto the quilt and counted them over and over again just in case we had made a mistake the first time, but we hadn't. Philip sighed deeply. I shall nearly be ready to go back to boarding school by the time I get that camera, he said sadly. I wish we could get some money, Ruth. We gazed out into the garden rather sadly, racking our brains for some plan, but nothing brilliant suggested itself to us. Below us, April had touched the fruit trees, and blossoms floated like a soft white sea over the plain. Our own damson plum trees were white and lacy, and I could see nests of primroses around their roots and golden daffodils in the sun. I looked across to the hills I loved, and they were hidden in the early haze of a spring morning. All of a sudden, I felt Philip's body stiffen, and he'd half dived out of the window in his eagerness. A brown creeper, he hissed, on the plum tree. I leaned out beside him, and we watched together. A neat little brown bird running up and down the tree, tapping the bark for insects. Philip was all alert now, noting every slightest pose and gesture, hardly drawing his breath until the little creature had spread its wings and disappeared around the corner. And then out came his pen and his notebook, and my brother was busy for 5 minutes. Ruth, he said eagerly, looking up at the end of that time, we must get to the woods early today. We have plenty of time. And Ruth, I was thinking in bed last night, we really ought to have a naturalist's headquarters out there. We ought to build a place where we could keep our pencils and paper and things like that in tins instead of always carrying them with us. Because we shall go every day during holidays, and we must get out early before Aunt Margaret thinks of things we ought to do. I nearly tumbled out of bed in my eagerness. We'll race through our holiday jobs, I announced, and I'll be as good as gold, so she'll hardly notice me, and she won't watch me, and when I've swept and dusted the drawing room, which would be the living room to us, I'll just slip out before she thinks of anything else. And if she asks us where we've been, we'll just say that we've been getting firewood. and we'll bring a little bit back with us so that we'll make it true. But I don't see why we should have to do all the work during our holidays. I know what I'll do. I'll dress quick, and I'll go down now, and I'll help Aunt Margaret with breakfast and make her see how good I'm being. I was out of bed in a flash, and in 10 minutes' time I presented myself at the kitchen, arrayed in a clean apron with my hair perfectly in order. "Can I help you, Aunt Margaret?" I inquired meekly. "I got up early in case you might need me." As I was noted for my laziness in the mornings and my lateness, my aunt looked astonished. "Well, thank you, Ruth," she said pleasantly, hiding her amazement. "You can set the table for me. I would be very glad of that." Everything went smoothly. Philip and I bolted our breakfast down and sat bottling up our impatience while Uncle Peter and Aunt Margaret sipped their cups of coffee and discussed the day ahead. Then Uncle Peter went off and Aunt Margaret turned to us. "And what plans have you two made?" she asked. Philip had an answer already. "As soon as we've done our holiday jobs, we're going to get some wood, Aunt Margaret," he said in his sweetest voice. "Very well," said the aunt a little doubtfully. "But you must remember, I need your help in the mornings. Ruth is old enough to help me in the house now. She could start with doing the dishes and dusting in the living room, and then we'll see." I'm going to call it the drawing room because that's what they call it. And you just know that it's the living room where the sofa and chairs are, and the fireplace and things like that. I could be quick when I liked, and I wiped up the breakfast things in astonishingly short time. Then, without any further consultation with my aunt, I grabbed the broom and the duster, and I made for the drawing room. I poked the dust wildly around the floor with the broom and flicked it off the ledges at top speed. I hadn't been able to find the dustpan, but I didn't waste time looking for it. I gathered up my little heap of dust and shoved it under the carpet. Then I tiptoed back to the kitchen, replaced the broom and the duster, and was out the front door like a streak of lightning. Out and free on an April morning with the sun shining and the birds singing and the lambs bleating, I tore around the back like a whirlwind and pounced upon Philip unexpectedly, nearly knocking him over, but he was used to me by now and it wasn't scary for him. "Finished already?" he said, rather surprised. "Yes, haven't you?" "No," he said. "I've got to chop these sticks into little bundles for kindling wood. It'll take ages." "Oh," I said, "we can't wait for that." "You've made quite enough of those silly little bundles. No one will know we haven't chopped them all up if they can't see the rest that we haven't chopped yet. Quick, give those unchopped ones to me." And before my more conscientious brother could protest, I heaved the remainder of them into the ditch and kicked dead leaves over the tops of them. "And think," I shouted, prancing up and down, "how quickly we shall find them when we're sent to get more." And so, with a final leap, I was away across to the orchard, away through the clean, wet grass all starred with primroses, out through the gap in the back hedge like a young rabbit, and Philip close at my heels. The gap in the shrubbery was our own special right-of-way, and no one else knew about it. Aunt Margaret could see the gate from the kitchen window, and sometimes we preferred to keep our comings and goings to ourselves, so we had found a gap behind the hen house, invisible to anyone else on account of the overhanging branches, which we brushed aside. It led out into another meadow, which led to the road, which in turn led to our woods. Once in the road, I danced and shouted like a young mad thing. It was sheer joy to be alive on such a morning. Philip followed a little more soberly, his eyes glued to the hedges, every now and then stopping to listen or to watch. I didn't wait for him. I felt as though spring had got into my feet. I think I scared away most of the birds before Philip came anywhere near them. I vaulted the gate that led through the meadow and stood still for a minute, watching the sober mother sheep with their merry long-legged lambs leaping like me among the daisies. And as I watched, one of the lambs, with a smudged nose and black stockings, suddenly saw me and came rushing toward me, uttering little bleats of welcome. When she says it had a smudged nose, it just means that part of its wool growing on its face was a little bit black around its nose. Sometimes sheep have little black noses, little black faces. I squatted down and held out my arms, and he ran straight into them and started licking my face with his eager, warm tongue. Philip, Philip, look what's happening, I cried. Philip was beside me soon, and together we knelt in the grass, while the little orphan prodded us, licked us, and jumped from one lap into another. And as we were playing with him, an old shepherd came and leaned over the gate, smiling at us. That's the little orphan, he explained. He's bottle fed, so he's not afraid of anyone. The other sheep push him away, so he often goes off on his own. He's always into mischief, that little rascal. The lamb at this moment leaped from my knee and ran to the gate, and the old man stooped and picked it up. He knows my voice all right, doesn't he? He remarked smilingly, and then, tucking it inside his coat, he turned back toward the farm. That's a new shepherd, said Philip. I've never seen him before. Oh, I have. He's over for the lambing season. Come on, Ruth, we're wasting time, Philip said. He jumped up and we raced across the open meadow with the wind blowing my braids out behind me, and then over a stile, and we were standing in our woods. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? That's where we're going to stop today. Do you remember from the books about Narnia what a stile is? It's a little step or a little tiny narrow opening in a fence, whether it's a wooden fence or a stone fence. It's a very narrow way for a person to get across. They can maybe go up a tiny step and over the other side, or maybe there's a little tiny gap, just enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, but not big enough for a sheep or a cow or a goat or some farm animal to squeeze through. That's what a stile is, S-T-I-L-E. Not style like fashion, S-T-Y-L-E. But you knew all that already, didn't you? Because you're just so smart. And you've been listening to my stories before, maybe. Anyway, that's the end of our chapters for tonight. Tomorrow we'll be back with more from the Tanglewoods Secret. Bye for now, everybody. Love you. See you soon.